in a small village called Jiporo in Namibia, Christmas wasn't like Christmas in other places. Here, it wasn't just about gifts and family, it was about fear. Every year, when December came, the people became quiet. They whispered about Omungundu, a giant spider that would wake up on Christmas Eve. The spider always took someone from the village as a sacrifice. If it didn't get what it wanted, bad things would happen. The elders told the story every year to remind the villagers. They said that a long time ago, the spider was angered when someone from the village stole something precious from its cave. Since then, it demanded a person every Christmas. Kauna, a 20-year-old girl, didn't believe any of it. She lived with her grandmother, who often told her about Omungundu. Kauna always laughed it off. "It's just an old story, Grandma," she'd say. Kauna wanted to leave the village one day and study in Windhoek, the capital city. She didn't think legends and curses were worth worrying about. But this year felt strange. People in the village were more nervous than usual. The elders were holding secret meetings, and Papandanji, the village healer, was burning herbs every night. The smell filled the air, and Kauna could see the worry on her grandmother's face. Still, Kauna told herself it was all nonsense. She tried to focus on her plans for the future. But deep down, she felt something was different this time. The fear in the village was stronger, heavier. And no matter how much Kauna tried to ignore it, a small voice in her head whispered that maybe, just maybe, the story was real. Kauna woke up early on December 23rd. The sun was shining brightly, and everything seemed normal. But as she stretched her arms, she noticed something strange. There was a mark on her arm, right above her wrist. It looked like a small, perfect spiderweb. Kauna frowned and rubbed at the mark, thinking it was dirt. But it didn't come off. She washed her arm, scrubbed it hard, but the mark stayed exactly the same. Her grandmother saw it when Kauna came out of the house. The old woman froze, her eyes wide with fear. "No," she whispered, almost to herself. "It can't be. What's wrong?" Kauna asked, feeling a little uneasy. Her grandmother grabbed her arm and stared at the mark. "You've been chosen," she said softly. Kauna pulled her arm away. "Chosen? What are you talking about?" Her grandmother's voice shook. "The spider has chosen you. Every year, it picks someone. The mark is the sign. This year, it's you." Kauna's heart started to race. She didn't believe in the spider, but her grandmother's fear was real. "It's just a rash or something," Kauna said, trying to sound calm. "It'll go away." Her grandmother shook her head. "No, this mark doesn't go away. You need to see Papa Ndanji. He might know what to do." Kauna felt annoyed but also scared. What if her grandmother was right? She decided to visit Papa Ndanji, hoping he would tell her it was nothing. But when the healer saw the mark, his face turned serious. "The legend is real," he said quietly. "The spider has chosen you. You have 2 nights before it comes for you." Kauna's hands started to tremble. "What am I supposed to do?" Papa Ndanji sighed. "You must find a way to face it. But no one has ever survived Omungundu." Kauna walked back home from Papa Ndanji's hut, her mind spinning. The words he said kept repeating in her head. "You have 2 nights." It felt like a terrible dream. She wanted to wake up and laugh about how silly it all was. But the mark on her arm was still there, and everyone's frightened faces told her this was real. When she got home, her grandmother was waiting by the door. "What did Papa Ndanji say?" she asked quietly. Kauna sat down and tried to keep her voice steady. "He said the spider is real, and that I've been chosen." Her grandmother nodded sadly. "I feared this would happen. Kauna, you are brave, but this is something no one has ever escaped." Kauna's anger flared. "Why should I suffer for something I didn't do? Why do we keep letting this happen?" Her grandmother looked down at her hands. "It is the price we pay for our ancestors' mistakes. Many have tried to fight the spider, but they never returned. The curse cannot be stopped. Kauna stood up, determination rising inside her. Then I'll stop it. I'll end this curse so no one else has to go through this. Her grandmother's eyes filled with tears. Kauna, you're strong, but the spider is stronger. Please don't do anything reckless. That evening, as the sun set, the villagers gathered in the square. Word had spread about Kauna's mark. People whispered as she walked by, their faces pale and worried. Some prayed, others looked at her with pity. Peter, Kauna's best friend, ran up to her. "Kauna, is it true? Are you?" Kauna nodded, showing him the mark. "I don't have a choice, Peter. I have to face it." Peter grabbed her arm. "Then I'm coming with you." Kauna stared at Peter, surprised. "No, Peter. It's too dangerous. I can't let you risk your life." Peter shook his head firmly. "You're my best friend. I'm not letting you do this alone." Before Kauna could argue, Papandanji appeared, carrying a long wooden spear. It was carved with strange symbols and wrapped in leather at the handle. "If you're serious about facing the spider, take this," he said, handing it to Kauna. She hesitated before taking the spear. "Will this kill it?" Papandanji sighed. "The spear is made from the sacred tree of our ancestors. It's powerful, but I cannot promise it will defeat Omungundu. You'll need more than just a weapon. You'll need courage and a sharp mind." Peter held up his hand. "Do you have another spear for me?" Papandanji frowned. "This is no game, boy. Kauna has the mark. She's the chosen one, not you." Peter stepped forward, determined. "If she's going, I'm going. I'll help her, no matter what." Kauna felt a mix of gratitude and worry. She didn't want Peter to get hurt, but she knew she couldn't stop him. "Fine," she said. "But if it gets too dangerous, promise me you'll leave." Peter nodded, though Kauna wasn't sure she believed him. That night, Kauna packed a small bag with food and water. Her grandmother gave her a necklace with a small stone hanging from it. "This belonged to your mother," she said, her voice breaking. "She was strong, just like you. Wear it for protection." Kauna hugged her grandmother tightly. "I'll come back," she whispered. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Kauna and Peter stood at the edge of the village, ready to begin their journey. The mountains loomed in the distance, dark and foreboding. "Are you ready?" Peter asked. Kauna tightened her grip on the spear. "I have to be." Kauna and Peter stepped into the wilderness, leaving the safety of their village behind. The path ahead was rough, surrounded by dry grass and thorny bushes. The moon cast a pale light over the land, making shadows dance in eerie patterns. Peter tried to lighten the mood. "So, what's the plan? Are we just going to walk up to a giant spider and say, 'Hi, could you stop eating people?'" Kauna smirked but didn't respond. Her thoughts were heavy, and the weight of the spear in her hand reminded her of what was at stake. The first hour was quiet, except for the sound of their footsteps and the occasional call of a night bird. But as they walked further, the air grew colder, and an unsettling silence settled around them. Even the insects seemed to disappear. "Do you feel that?" Peter asked, shivering. Kauna nodded. "It's like the air itself is watching us." They stopped to rest under a large tree. Kauna took a sip of water and stared at the mark on her arm. It felt warm, almost like it was pulsing. "Peter," she said quietly, "what if I don't survive this?" Peter leaned closer, his face serious. "You will. You're the strongest person I know. And besides, I won't let anything happen to you." Kauna wanted to believe him, but deep down, she wasn't sure. The stories about Omungundu were too terrifying. How could a simple spear and her determination defeat something so ancient and powerful? As they prepared to continue, a low, rumbling noise stopped them in their tracks. The ground beneath their feet trembled slightly. Peter gripped her arm. "What was that?" Kauna tightened her hold on the spear, her heart racing. "I think it knows we're coming." The rumbling noise grew louder, and the ground shook harder. Peter grabbed a branch to steady himself, while Kauna raised the spear, her eyes darting around. Then it stopped. The air became still, so silent that they could hear their own breathing. "Maybe it's just an earthquake," Peter whispered, though his voice trembled. Kauna shook her head. "No, it's something else." Before she could say more, a large shadow moved in the distance. It was fast, too fast. Kauna squinted, trying to see what it was. Suddenly, a sharp hissing sound echoed through the night, sending chills down their spines. Peter pulled out a small knife from his belt. "What do we do?" "Stay close," Kauna said, her voice firm despite the fear gripping her chest. The shadow moved again, this time closer. They could see glowing red eyes staring at them from the darkness. But it wasn't the spider, it was something smaller, though still terrifying. A creature leapt out of the bushes. It was a large hairy animal with long legs and sharp fangs. It looked like a smaller version of Omungundu, but it was still bigger than any spider Kauna had ever seen. Kauna didn't wait. She thrust the spear forward, her movements quick and precise. The creature screeched and tried to lunge at her, but Peter threw a rock at its head, distracting it. "Go for its legs," Peter shouted. Kauna struck again, hitting one of the creature's legs. It let out a piercing cry and scurried back into the bushes. The forest became silent once more. Peter exhaled deeply, his hands shaking. "If that was just a small one, what's the big one like?" Kauna wiped the sweat from her forehead. "We're going to find out soon enough." They continued walking, their steps heavier than before. Now, they knew the dangers were real, and the real battle was still ahead. Kauna and Peter kept moving, their hearts pounding from the encounter with the smaller spider. The wilderness seemed to close in around them. Trees with gnarled branches cast long, twisted shadows. As they walked, Kauna noticed something strange on the ground. Thin, white threads were spread across the path. They shimmered in the moonlight, sticky and strong like strands of a spider's web. "Careful," she whispered, stopping Peter. Peter crouched down to examine the web. "It's huge. No normal spider could make this." Kauna's mark began to tingle again, sending a shiver up her arm. She gripped the spear tighter. "We're getting close." The web wasn't just on the ground. As they moved further, they saw it stretching between trees, covering bushes, and even hanging from the sky like ghostly curtains. It was everywhere. Peter reached out to touch a strand, but Kauna slapped his hand away. "Don't. It could be a trap." Peter nodded, his face pale. "If the webs are this big, how big is the spider?" Kauna didn't answer. She didn't want to think about it. The path became harder to navigate as the webs grew thicker. At one point, they had to crawl under a massive sheet of it. The sticky threads clung to their clothes, making every movement slow and careful. Then they heard it, a soft clicking sound, like claws tapping against stone. It was faint but growing louder. Peter's eyes widened. "Do you hear that?" Kauna nodded, her breath quickening. "It's coming." They hurried forward, desperate to find a clearing or somewhere to hide. But the webs grew denser, forcing them to slow down. The clicking grew louder, and Kauna felt the ground tremble slightly. "Stay calm," she whispered to Peter, though her voice shook. "We need to keep moving." But deep down, she knew they were walking straight into the spider's lair. As Kauna and Peter pushed through the web-covered forest, they felt like they were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every movement in the shadows, made them stop and look around. "Do you think it's following us?" Peter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kauna scanned the trees. "I don't know. But we can't stop now." Suddenly, a pair of glowing red eyes appeared in the distance. Then another pair. And another. Peter grabbed Kauna's arm. "There's more than one." Kauna's stomach twisted with fear. "No. These are its children, the ones the villagers talked about. The smaller spiders were everywhere, their red eyes shining in the darkness like tiny flames. They didn't attack right away. Instead, they stayed just out of reach, surrounding Kauna and Peter like hunters waiting for the perfect moment. Peter held his knife tightly. "What do we do?" Kauna raised her spear, trying to steady her trembling hands. "We keep moving. Slowly. Don't make any sudden moves." They inched forward, the spiders watching their every step. Kauna could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. One wrong move, and the spiders would pounce. The clicking sound returned, louder and sharper this time. The smaller spiders scattered, vanishing into the trees. Kauna and Peter froze. "Why are they leaving?" Peter whispered. Kauna's eyes darted around. "Because something bigger is coming." The ground shook, and the air grew colder. In the distance, a massive shadow loomed, moving closer. Kauna tightened her grip on the spear. Peter's voice quivered. "Is that it?" Kauna nodded slowly, her heart racing. Omungundu! The giant spider had arrived. The massive figure of Omungundu stepped into the faint light of the moon, and Kauna's breath caught in her throat. The spider was enormous, its body covered in thick, black fur that shimmered as it moved. Its legs, long and sharp like spears, made soft clicking sounds as they struck the ground. Its red eyes glowed brighter than the smaller spiders, and they locked onto Kauna and Peter with an unsettling intelligence. Peter stumbled back, almost dropping his knife. It's bigger than I imagined." Kauna swallowed hard. Her hands gripped the spear so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The mark on her arm burned, as if reacting to the spider's presence. Omungundu moved closer, its legs barely making a sound now. It was eerily quiet, its huge body seeming to glide over the webs. Kauna's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay still. The spider stopped a few steps away, tilting its head slightly, as if studying her. Its eyes flicked down to the mark on her arm. Then it let out a deep, guttural hiss that echoed through the forest. "Kauna," Peter whispered, "what do we do?" Kauna took a deep breath. "We have to keep it away from the village. If it wants me, I'll lead it further into the forest." Peter's eyes widened. "Are you crazy? You'll get yourself killed." "It's the only way," Kauna said firmly. The spider hissed again, lowering its massive body like a predator ready to strike. Kauna stepped forward, pointing the spear at it. "Come on then," she shouted, her voice trembling but determined. Omungundu lunged, its enormous legs crashing into the ground where they had just been standing. "Run!" Kauna yelled, grabbing Peter's arm. They sprinted into the forest, the spider close behind them. Kauna and Peter ran as fast as they could, dodging webs and jumping over roots. The giant spider chased them, its legs crashing through the forest like thunder. "Kauna!" Peter shouted between breaths. "It's too fast. We can't outrun it." "We don't have to," Kauna yelled back. "We just need to find somewhere to hide." Ahead of them, the trees grew thicker, their branches twisting together to form a dark canopy. Kauna spotted a narrow path leading into a cluster of rocks. "This way," she called, pulling Peter toward it. They squeezed through the gap between the rocks, the spider's massive legs scraping against the stone as it tried to follow. The rocks were too tight for its body to fit through, but it didn't give up. Instead, it let out an ear-splitting screech that made Kauna's ears ring. "It's going to find another way around," Peter panted, leaning against the rock. "We can't stay here." Kauna nodded, her mind racing. She looked at the spear in her hand. It felt powerful, but she didn't know if it was enough to defeat Omungundu. "We need to set a trap," she said. "If we can weaken it, we might have a chance." Peter stared at her, his face pale. "How do you trap something that big?" Kauna thought for a moment, then pointed to the thick webs hanging from the trees. "The webs are sticky. If we can lead it into a tangle of them, it might slow it down." Peter hesitated, then nodded. Okay, but we'll need bait. Kauna clenched her jaw. I'll be the bait. Peter grabbed her arm. No, you can't. It's me at once, Kauna said, cutting him off. You go and set the trap. I'll lead it to you. Before Peter could argue, the ground shook again. The spider was circling the rocks, looking for a way in. Go, Kauna urged. Peter hesitated, then turned and disappeared into the forest. Kauna took a deep breath, gripping the spear tightly. Come on, you monster, she muttered, stepping out into the open. Kauna's heart hammered in her chest as she stood in the open, her eyes fixed on the massive spider. Omungundu was circling the rocks, its red eyes glowing brightly, searching for her. She gripped the spear, trying to steady her shaking hands. The spider paused and tilted its head as if sensing her presence. Slowly, it began to move toward her. The ground trembled with each of its steps. Kauna didn't wait. She sprinted into the forest, weaving between the trees, knowing the spider was right behind her. Every few steps, she glanced over her shoulder to see Omungundu's shadow growing larger. The sound of its legs crashing against the ground filled her ears. She had to get it closer to the trap. Peter was already waiting for her, hiding behind a large tree, ready to spring into action. As Kauna ran, she heard Peter's voice calling from ahead. This way. Let it here. Kauna changed direction, heading toward Peter's voice. The spider followed, faster now, enraged by the chase. The ground shook more violently as Omungundu closed in. Kauna could feel the heat from its massive body behind her. Come on, Peter shouted, throwing a rock into the air to distract the spider. The rock landed with a thud just beyond the trap. Kauna sprinted faster, pushing herself to the limit. She could feel the webbing all around them now. The air felt sticky, heavy with the scent of the spider's presence. Her breath was ragged, and her legs were starting to tire. She reached the trap, where Peter had carefully spread the sticky webs across the ground and wrapped them around trees. She didn't look back. Instead, she turned quickly, stepping into the center of the trap, drawing the spider's attention even more. Peter! Kauna yelled. Peter jumped out from behind the tree, throwing his knife at one of the web strands. The blade cut through the air and landed in the web, causing it to unravel and snap back, pulling some of the webs tight. The spider screeched as it barreled toward Kauna, unaware of the trap set ahead. She held her breath and stepped back, just as the spider lunged. Suddenly, its legs got caught in the thick, sticky webs, and the giant spider let out an enraged hiss. The webbing pulled tight, trapping the spider in place. Kauna and Peter backed away, hearts racing as the spider struggled against the trap. Its massive legs thrashed, trying to break free from the sticky webs that had entangled it. The sound of its screeching filled the night air. No! Kauna shouted. We have to finish it before it breaks free. Peter grabbed a heavy rock and hurled it at the spider's body, but it barely even seemed to notice. The webs around its legs were strong, but Omungundu was still a terrifying force, its strength evident in the way it twisted and jerked its massive body. Kauna took a deep breath and approached the spider slowly. We have to aim for its weak spots, its eyes, its heart. Peter nodded, though his hands were shaking. He wasn't sure how to kill a spider of that size, but he knew they had no choice. Kauna steadied the spear in her hands, looking carefully at the creature. She aimed for one of the red eyes glowing in the dark. With a deep breath, she lunged forward, driving the spear toward the spider's eye. Omungundu screeched in pain, its body jerking violently. Kauna pulled the spear back, but the spider wasn't done yet. It swiped its legs in every direction, trying to knock her off balance. Peter grabbed her arm, pulling her back just in time. It's still too strong. Kauna shook her head. No. We have to keep going. The spider's eyes blazed with fury. Omungundu knew it was trapped, but that didn't mean it was finished. Its legs pushed harder against the webbing, and Kauna could see the strands beginning to break. "Peter!" Kauna shouted. "We need more weight." Peter looked around frantically. "What do you mean?" Kauna's eyes landed on a large boulder near the edge of the trap. "Push that over here. We can trap it completely if we add more pressure." Peter didn't hesitate. He rushed to the boulder and, with all his strength, began rolling it toward the spider. Kauna joined him, and together, they pushed the heavy rock into the webbing. The added weight caused the webs to tighten further, trapping the spider even more. But Omungundu was still not giving up. The spider's screeching intensified as the added weight of the boulder pressed down on its legs, but it was still struggling with all its might to free itself. The webs were straining, snapping under the spider's violent movements. Kauna could feel the ground tremble beneath her feet, and she knew they didn't have much time left before the trap would give way. "Kauna," Peter said, his voice tight with fear, "we can't hold it much longer." "I know," Kauna answered. Her eyes were locked on Omungundu, which was now pulling harder against the webbing, making the trees around it groan under the pressure. She gripped the spear tighter, determined not to let the beast escape. She took a deep breath. This was it. If she didn't do something now, they were both going to die. Kauna ran toward the spider, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to finish it. With the boulder pinning it down, she had a chance. The webbing would be tighter, and the spider's movements slower. She aimed for the same eye she had struck earlier, hoping to weaken it even more. With all her strength, she thrust the spear forward again. This time, she didn't just aim for the eye. She aimed for the spider's head, directly into the center of its skull. The spear sank into the spider's flesh with a sickening crack, and Omungundu let out a final, ear-piercing screech. Its body twitched, its massive legs jerking uncontrollably. Kauna stumbled back, breathing heavily, as the giant spider collapsed. The webs around it seemed to snap with the force of its fall, but the spider did not rise again. Peter ran to her side, wide-eyed and gasping for air. Did you kill it?" Kauna nodded slowly, her body trembling with exhaustion. "I think so." They stood there for a moment, watching the lifeless spider. The silence was deafening. Finally, Kauna felt the mark on her arm fade. The strange burning sensation that had been there since the beginning began to disappear. It was as if the curse that had haunted her for so long had finally been lifted. "Is it over?" Peter asked quietly. Kauna didn't answer at first. She only stared at the defeated Omungundu, her mind racing. The village, the forest, the curse, it was all connected. But now, it seemed that she had broken the cycle. "It's over," she said softly, her voice full of relief. Chapter 14. A New Beginning. The sun rose slowly the next morning, casting golden light over the forest. Kauna and Peter sat by the edge of the clearing, watching the first rays break through the trees. The weight of the battle had lifted, but a heavy silence remained in the air. Kauna looked at the place where Omungundu had fallen. There were no signs left of the giant spider, only crushed webs and broken trees. She felt a deep sense of finality, but also a strange emptiness. "How did you know how to defeat it?" Peter asked, breaking the silence. Kauna looked at him, surprised. "I didn't. She paused, searching for the right words. "I just had to believe that I could. I couldn't let it keep hurting people." Peter nodded, clearly understanding. "We should go back to the village," Kauna said, her voice steady. "Let everyone know it's safe now." They stood up and began walking toward the village, the quiet forest around them now feeling peaceful. The trees seemed less threatening, the air fresher, as if the curse that had haunted the land for so long had finally been lifted. When they reached the village, the people gathered around, wide-eyed and curious. They had been waiting anxiously, unsure if Kauna would return. When they saw her, alive and unharmed, a cheer erupted from the crowd. The elders stepped forward, their faces filled with awe. The leader of the elders, an old woman with kind eyes, spoke first. "Kauna," she said gently, "you have done what many before you could not. You have freed us from Omungundu." Kauna smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "It's over now," she said simply. "We're free." As the villagers celebrated, Kauna stood quietly at the edge of the crowd. She had faced the greatest fear of her life, and now she had helped end it. But her journey was not over. She had seen the way the land and people had suffered under the curse, and she knew that there was more work to be done. The scars left by Omungundu would take time to heal. But for the first time in many years, Kauna felt hope. Over the next few weeks, life slowly returned to normal in the village. The people were no longer afraid of the dark or the forest. The crops began to grow again, and the air seemed fresher, lighter. Kauna, though exhausted, was grateful to see the village healing. She often visited the elders, learning from their wisdom and helping where she could. One evening, as she sat by the fire, she thought about what came next. The curse had been broken, but there was still much to be done. The people would need guidance, and Kauna knew she could be the one to offer it. She looked over at Peter, who had been by her side throughout everything. He had helped her set the trap, supported her when she was ready to give up. Without him, she knew she couldn't have done it. "You've helped so much," Kauna said to him one evening as they watched the stars. Peter smiled. "I couldn't have done it without you." Kauna thought about the future. The curse was broken, but the real journey had just begun. She had faced the Omungundu. Now, it was time to help her people rebuild and move forward. The land had suffered for too long, but with the strength she had gained, Kauna knew she could help heal the wounds. And that, she realized, was the first step toward a new beginning. The next few months were filled with hard work. Kauna and Peter helped rebuild homes, plant crops, and restore the village. Kauna's courage and strength had earned her respect from everyone, but it was her kindness and wisdom that truly set her apart. The elders began to teach her their ways, passing down the knowledge that had been kept hidden for generations. Kauna learned not just how to survive, but how to protect the land and its people. As she grew in her role, she realized that her battle with Omungundu was only a small part of a much larger story. The true test of her strength would be in helping her people rebuild a future free of fear. Years later, Kauna became the village leader, known not only for her bravery in defeating the spider, but also for her wisdom in guiding the people toward peace and prosperity. Her legacy lived on long after the battle with Omungundu, in every person she had helped, every seed she had planted, and every story told of the girl who had faced the greatest fear and turned it into hope for the future. And so, Kauna's name was remembered forever, not as the girl who defeated a monster, but as the woman who brought life back to a broken world.